I've always been drawn to the mountains. The solitude, the silence, the sense of peace that comes with each step deeper into the wilderness. It was my way of clearing my head. Every weekend, I'd take to the trails, losing myself in the rhythm of my boots crunching against dirt and pine needles. Oregon, with its mist-shrouded forests and towering peaks, became my escape. And among the many trails I frequented, the one up near Mount Hood was my favorite. It's an old logging road, mostly overgrown now, winding through thick woods before opening into a breathtaking view of the mountain. I've hiked it dozens of times, in all seasons. I knew every turn, every tree, every sound that typically echoed through the forest. But one afternoon, something changed. I set out later than usual that day. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees, the air thick with the earthy smell of damp soil and moss. The trail was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze or the distant chirp of birds. As I climbed, I let my thoughts wander, my body moving on autopilot through the familiar terrain. But about halfway up the trail, something caught my eye. Movement, faint at first, barely noticeable in my peripheral vision. I stopped, turning around. There, about 100 yards behind me, stood a figure, a person, dressed in a dark hood, their face obscured by the shadow. I didn't think much of it at first. This trail wasn't exactly a secret, and I often passed other hikers along the way. But there was something about this person that made me uneasy. They were too still. Not checking a phone, not tying a shoe, just standing there, facing me. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was overreacting. It wasn't uncommon for people to stop and rest. I kept walking, trying to shake the feeling that clung to me like a fog. But after a few minutes, curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced back again. The figure had moved. They were closer now, maybe 50 yards behind me. Still walking, still silent. A cold shiver crawled up my spine, but I pushed it aside. They're just hiking, I told myself. Nothing weird about that. I picked up my pace, my boots hitting the trail with a little more urgency than before. But the sense of unease only grew stronger. Every few minutes, I turned to check, and each time, the figure was closer. They were walking too, but their steps were slow, measured. They never ran, never hurried, just kept the same deliberate pace, slowly closing the gap between us. By the time I reached the part of the trail where it branches off, the figure was no more than 20 yards behind me. I could make out more details now. The hood was pulled low, covering most of their face. Their clothes were dark, and there was something unsettling about the way they moved, almost mechanical, like they were on a set course with no intention of stopping. My heart raced. I didn't want to believe it, but every instinct screamed that something was wrong. I told myself to stay calm, that maybe it was just a coincidence, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I turned off the main trail, hoping to lose them on a side path. It was narrower, less traveled, and wound deeper into the woods. I figured if they were just another hiker, they'd stick to the main route. But when I glanced back, my stomach twisted in fear. The figure had followed me. That was when panic set in. I started running, my feet pounding against the dirt as branches whipped at my face. The trees seemed to close in around me, the air thick and oppressive. I didn't care where I was going, I just wanted to put as much distance as possible between me and whoever that was. I veered off the path entirely, crashing through the underbrush. The sound of my own frantic breathing filled my ears, but underneath it, I could hear something else, footsteps. Slow, steady, deliberate. I was running as fast as I could, branches clawing at my clothes, the ground uneven beneath my feet, but the footsteps never sped up. They just continued unhurried, but always there. Always behind me. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to stretch, the forest warping around me as my fear grew. But eventually, I saw the glint of metal through the trees. My car. I burst into the clearing, legs burning, chest heaving. I didn't stop running until I reached the driver's side door, fumbling with the keys in my shaking hands. I jumped into the car, locking the doors as soon as I was inside. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, I glanced up at the trailhead, expecting to see the figure emerge from the woods. But there was nothing. No one. I sat there for a long time, heart hammering, eyes scanning the trees. But the figure never appeared. After what felt like hours, I peeled out of the parking lot, tires skidding on the gravel. For the next few days, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe they were lost, or just another hiker who happened to be on the same trail. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, the unease never went away. A week passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Everywhere I went, I had the sensation of being watched. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, on the street, in my backyard, in the reflection of windows, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my window. Slow, deliberate, like the ones I'd heard on the trail. My bedroom is on the second floor, so there was no way anyone could be walking outside the window. But the sound was unmistakable, heavy, crunching footsteps on gravel. I lay frozen in my bed, listening as the footsteps circled the house. They stopped at the front door, and for a long moment, there was silence. Then, 3 slow knocks. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The knocks came again, louder this time. I wanted to scream, but my voice was trapped in my throat. After what felt like an eternity, the knocking stopped, and the footsteps faded into the distance. The next morning, I found something on my doorstep. A single, muddy footprint. I stopped hiking after that. Months have passed since that day on the trail, but the fear still lingers. I haven't seen the figure again, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear those footsteps, slow, steady, deliberate, echoing through the silence. I don't know who they were, or what they wanted. But I do know one thing: I'll never feel safe in the woods again. I was having an affair. I'm not proud of it, but at the time, it was easy to justify. I told myself it was just a distraction, that it didn't mean anything. Christine was younger, and she was everything my marriage wasn't: exciting, unpredictable. We'd meet at a small, rundown motel just outside of Phoenix. The type of place where no one asks questions and everyone minds their own business. That night, like the others, we had spent a few hours together in the room. Christine was in the shower, and I sat on the edge of the bed, mentally preparing myself to leave. It was always the hardest part, walking out and heading back to my real life. I heard the water turn off, but I didn't wait for her to come out. There was no point in dragging things out, so I grabbed my jacket and opened the door to step into the dimly lit hallway. That's when I saw him. He was standing at the end of the hallway, bathed in the sickly glow of a flickering light bulb. Just standing there, motionless, staring right at me. His clothes were dark, a jacket zipped up to his neck despite the heat, and his face was pale under the yellowish light. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stood there, like he was waiting for something. My first instinct was to close the door, and I did, quickly, heart pounding in my chest. I leaned against the door, listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no sounds of movement. Just silence. When Christine came out of the bathroom, I told her about the guy at the end of the hallway. She looked at me with a mix of annoyance and disbelief, her towel wrapped around her as she dried her hair. "You're just being paranoid," she said. "Maybe he's staying in one of the other rooms." But I knew that wasn't it. There was something about the way he was standing, staring, like he had been waiting for me to come out. Still, I tried to shake it off. Christine had a way of making me feel like I was overthinking things, like everything was just in my head. I opened the door again, expecting to see him still standing there, but the hallway was empty. I glanced around, my breath catching in my throat, but there was no sign of him. "See? Nothing," Christine said, peeking over my shoulder. I didn't say anything as I left the motel that night. The image of the man standing there lingered in my mind, but I convinced myself Christine was right. Maybe I was being paranoid. But then, things got worse. A week later, I got a phone call from the motel. The front desk clerk, a woman I vaguely remembered seeing once or twice, told me I had left something behind in the room. My heart sank. I hadn't left anything behind, at least nothing I could think of. I hadn't brought anything personal, just my wallet and phone, and I always made sure to check the room before I left. "What did I leave?" I asked, feeling a cold sweat forming at the back of my neck. "You left your wife's scarf," she said, her tone flat, matter-of-fact. My heart stopped. I hadn't brought anything of my wife's, not even close. I hadn't mentioned my wife to anyone at the motel, and there was no way I'd ever be careless enough to bring something of hers with me. I stammered, trying to find the words. I think you're mistaken," I said. "I didn't leave a scarf." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Well, it's here in the room. Do you want to come pick it up, or should we hold on to it for you?" Her voice was unnervingly calm, like she knew something I didn't. No. Just keep it." "I don't need it," I said, hanging up quickly. I sat there in silence, my mind racing. How did they know my wife's name? Why would they say I left something of hers behind? I didn't go back to the motel after that. I told Christine I needed some time to think, to lay low for a while. She didn't seem to mind. She had always been more casual about the whole thing than I was. But a week after that phone call, Christine called me, her voice tense. "I saw him again," she said, not bothering with a greeting. "Who?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "The guy from the hallway. He was in the parking lot, just standing there, staring at my car when I got out. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just watched me go inside." A chill ran down my spine. "Did you tell anyone?" "No. I mean, what am I supposed to say? He wasn't doing anything. But it was weird. The way he looked at me, like he knew something. I don't think I'm going back there either." After that, things at home started to unravel. My wife became distant, more than usual. She seemed distracted, always on her phone or going out without telling me where she was going. At first, I thought it was just the guilt eating away at me, making me paranoid again. But then I started noticing little things. Once I came home from work to find one of my wife's scarves, the same one the motel clerk had mentioned, laid out on our bed, even though I hadn't seen her wear it in months. Another time, I found my phone move from where I had left it, as though someone had been looking through it. I started getting strange texts too, from unknown numbers. They were short, cryptic messages like, "You should be more careful," and, "She knows." I couldn't shake the feeling that the man at the motel had followed me back into my life. Every time I saw a stranger standing on the street or noticed someone in a crowd watching me for too long, I wondered if it was him. I became paranoid, checking the locks on the doors and windows before bed, jumping at every little sound. The guilt of the affair was gnawing at me, but so was the fear that someone was watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal everything. One night, as I was lying in bed, my phone buzzed with a new message. I hesitated before opening it, my stomach turning with dread. It was from another unknown number, but this time, it wasn't just a cryptic message. It was a picture. A picture of me, standing outside the motel room, the door half open, staring down the hallway. In the background, barely visible in the grainy image, was the man, standing at the end of the hall, just like before. My blood ran cold. I hadn't taken the picture, and Christine wasn't the type to play games like this. My hands were shaking as I showed the phone to my wife, hoping to gauge her reaction, hoping she would tell me it was just a sick joke. But she didn't even look surprised. She took the phone from me, her eyes scanning the screen before handing it back without a word. "What is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she got up and walked to the window, staring out into the darkness. Then she turned to me, her expression unreadable. "I think you should leave," she said softly. "I don't need to know the details. But it's over." I packed a bag that night and left. I haven't spoken to Christine since, and I haven't been back to that motel. But the image of the man still haunts me, standing in that hallway, waiting for me. watching. And every now and then, I get a new message from an unknown number. No words. Just a picture of me, from somewhere I didn't know anyone was watching. I never told my wife the truth about the affair. But deep down, I know she already knew. I awoke with a jolt, a sudden, jarring sensation that ripped me from the depths of slumber. It was the kind of awakening that leaves you disoriented, heart pounding, and mind grappling to grasp the fragments of a dream that stubbornly clung to the edges of consciousness. My eyes fluttered open, and the familiar darkness of my bedroom was strangely amplified, a suffocating blanket that seemed to hold its breath. The first thing I noticed was the absence of my glasses. My nearsightedness, a constant companion since childhood, had rendered the world a blurry, indistinct canvas. Panic, a cold, clammy hand, tightened its grip around my chest. Where had they gone? I'd always placed them on the small nightstand beside my bed, a ritual etched into the routine of my nights. My hand reached out, fumbling blindly in the darkness, desperate to reclaim the familiar comfort of my glasses. My fingers brushed against something cold and slick, something that sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't the smooth surface of the nightstand. It was sticky. A wave of nausea washed over me. I pulled my hand back, the sensation of the unknown substance clinging to my skin like a second skin, revolting and unnerving. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silence of my late grandmother's house. I scrambled out of bed, my feet sinking into the sticky substance that seemed to have coated the floor. It clung to my pajamas, a grotesque, warm, and unnerving reminder of the sudden, inexplicable shift in my surroundings. My vision, without the aid of my glasses, was a swirling mess of indistinct shapes and colors. It was as if the familiar world of my bedroom had been smeared with a thick layer of Vaseline, distorting everything I knew. As my eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness, I realized I wasn't in my bedroom anymore. The familiar wooden walls, the comforting scent of aged wood and dust, the faint, reassuring glow of the hallway light, all were gone. Instead, I found myself in a grotesque parody of a landscape, bathed in an unnatural, sickly green light that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was a light that twisted shadows into grotesque shapes, exaggerating every imperfection, every contour, into exaggerated, monstrous forms. Towering, misshapen shadows danced and writhed in the periphery of my vision, their edges blurred and undefined, like apparitions conjured from nightmares. They were impossibly tall, stretching into the unsettling green light, their forms reminiscent of twisted trees, gnarled and crooked, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to grasp me. A piercing screech ripped through the eerie silence, a sound that seemed to claw at my very soul. It was a sound that sent waves of icy terror coursing through my body, a sound that burrowed into my mind, twisting my thoughts into a chaotic, frantic spiral. I crouched, my hands instinctively covering my ears, desperate to block out the monstrous sound. But it only grew louder, more intense, piercing through my desperate attempts at protection like a shard of glass shattering a delicate vase. My head throbbed in time with the escalating shriek, each pulse of pain echoing the rising crescendo of the terrifying sound. The world began to spin, a disorienting vortex of colors and shadows that threatened to consume me. My thoughts fragmented, dissolving into a sea of panic and confusion. I was trapped in a symphony of horror, a terrifying concert composed solely of dissonance and despair. Then, as suddenly as it began, the screech ended. Silence fell like a heavy shroud, a suffocating, chilling blanket that enveloped the grotesque landscape. The stillness was so profound, so complete, that it seemed to vibrate with an anticipatory dread. From the swirling mass of shadows, a figure emerged. It was cloaked in tattered, dark material, the edges frayed and torn as if ravaged by time or some unseen force. Its face was obscured by the deep folds of the cloak, but I could feel its presence, a palpable ripple of unsettling energy that emanated from it like a chilling aura. A raspy, chilling laugh echoed through the silence, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine and a fresh wave of terror through my body. It was a laughter that seemed to mock my fear, a laughter that promised more horror, more suffering. Run! The figure hissed, the voice a chilling whisper that seemed to originate from the very depths of the shadows. Its words were a simple command, but they carried the weight of a dire warning, a primal instinct urging me to flee. But I was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer terror that enveloped me. I knew, in the deepest recesses of my soul, that there was no escape. There was no place to run, no hiding place that could shield me from the horrors that were waiting in the heart of this nightmarish landscape. The figure in the tattered cloak began to move, its form slowly emerging from the shadows, a silhouette against the sickly green light. Each step it took seemed to reverberate through the landscape, a silent tremor that shook the very ground beneath my feet. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but my voice was trapped in my throat, a silent scream echoing only within the confines of my own terror. The figure's form took shape in my blurry vision, grotesquely elongated limbs and a head that seemed to bob precariously on a neck too thin to support it. My mind raced, desperately searching for answers, for a sliver of hope in this terrifying ordeal. What was happening? How had I ended up in this nightmarish place? Where was my grandmother? The image of my grandmother, her kind face and frail hands, flickered through my mind. She was the anchor of my life, the person who had instilled in me a sense of security and comfort. But even the comforting memory of her presence offered little solace in this horrifying reality. The figure in the cloak was now close, its presence a chilling wave of cold air that washed over me like an icy wind. I could see its eyes now, deep, black pits in the darkness of its face, glowing with an unsettling intensity. They were eyes that held no kindness, no compassion, only a terrifying, consuming hunger. I squeezed my eyes shut, the image of those eyes burning into my mind, refusing to fade. The fear was so intense, so overwhelming, that I felt the edges of my sanity beginning to fray. Then I felt it, a cold touch on my shoulder, a sensation that sent a jolt of terror through my entire body. I gasped, the air rushing out of my lungs in a ragged gasp. The figure was right behind me, its presence a physical manifestation of my deepest fears. Suddenly, a surge of adrenaline coursed through my veins. The primal instinct to survive, long dormant, awakened in the face of imminent danger. I lurched forward, breaking free from the paralysis of terror, and stumbled blindly through the nightmarish landscape. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to run. I had to escape the suffocating presence of the figure in the cloak, the relentless pursuit of whatever horror awaited me in this grotesque world. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic drumbeat that resonated with each step I took. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, treacherous, and covered in the same sticky, unnerving substance that had first alerted me to the shift in reality. I stumbled, my legs heavy and aching, my lungs burning with the exertion. The air was thick, heavy with a sickening sweetness that filled my nostrils and made my stomach churn. Each breath I took was a struggle, a desperate gasp for air in a world that seemed intent on suffocating me. The figure was still pursuing me, its ragged laughter echoing through the desolate landscape. It was a sound that clawed at my sanity, a chilling testament to the terror that relentlessly pursued me. I ran past towering, skeletal trees, their gnarled branches reaching out like grasping claws. I stumbled through fields of sickly green grass that seemed to writhe and pulse beneath my feet. I dodged monstrous shadows, each one a grotesque caricature of a familiar form, amplified and warped into something nightmarish and uncanny. I didn't dare to look back. I knew that if I did, I would be consumed by the terror that relentlessly pursued me. I focused solely on the task at hand, on putting one foot in front of the other, on escaping the nightmare that had seized me. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, terror, confusion, desperation, and a flickering ember of hope that refused to be extinguished. I clung to that ember, nurturing it with the desperate will to survive. I ran, I stumbled, I fell, and I got back up, fueled by an adrenaline-fueled determination to escape the horror that had engulfed me. The landscape around me seemed to shift and change, the sickening green light fluctuating in intensity. The shadows that had seemed so menacing at first now appeared to be a backdrop, a constant, unsettling reminder of the danger that lurked in the periphery. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the nightmare started to fade. The sickly green light began to recede, replaced by the faint, familiar glow of the hallway light in my grandmother's house. The grotesque shadows dissipated, revealing the familiar shapes of the furniture in my bedroom. I stumbled into my bedroom, collapsing onto the floor, my body trembling with exhaustion and terror. My lungs ached, my legs felt like lead, and my mind was a confused jumble of fragments and fleeting images. I looked around, my eyes slowly adjusting to the familiar surroundings of my room. The sticky substance was gone, replaced by the comforting texture of the worn carpet. My glasses were nestled on the nightstand, exactly where I had left them. It was as if the entire ordeal had been a dream, a fever dream fueled by the remnants of my anxieties and fears. But the deep-seated terror, the chilling memory of the figure in the tattered cloak, and the grotesque landscape, refused to fade. They were etched into my mind, a stark reminder that the boundaries between reality and nightmare were far more tenuous than I had ever imagined. I lay there for a long time, regaining my breath, my mind slowly disentangling itself from the threads of terror. The house was silent, the only sound the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I got up, my body stiff and aching, and made my way to the window. The twilight was fading, replaced by the inky blackness of night. The moon hung high in the sky, a pale orb in the vast expanse of darkness. I stood there for a long time, watching the night unfold, the fears still lingering in the corners of my mind. The world outside my window seemed peaceful, serene, a stark contrast to the horror I had just experienced. But I knew that the peace was an illusion, a fragile facade that could shatter at any moment. The evening had begun like any other in the sleepy town of Maplewood, but it ended etched with the haunting memory of a nightmare that threatened to shatter my sense of reality. The shadows that stretched long in the twilight now held a new meaning, a silent reminder that the darkness held secrets, hidden horrors that could surface at any moment. And I, forever marked by the nightmarish landscape and the figure in the tattered cloak, knew that I would never look at the shadows in quite the same way again. My wife, Natalie, had always been curious, a seeker of the unknown. What began as casual dinner discussions about harmless conspiracy theories, government cover-ups, hidden agendas, soon took a darker turn. I didn't notice it right away. It was so gradual, her change, that it almost slipped by unnoticed. Almost. At first, it was the small things. I would catch her scrolling through obscure forums on her phone long after I'd gone to bed, her face illuminated by the eerie glow of the screen. She'd whisper about connections between corporations and shadowy figures, but I always brushed it off as a phase, some hobby to pass the time. Everyone needs a distraction, right? I figured it would fade. But it didn't. It festered. Soon, she was up all night, staring at her laptop, pages of documents spread across the kitchen table. Lines of text and images plastered the walls, her handwriting scrawled beneath in frantic loops. She barely slept, surviving on black coffee and paranoia. I'd wake up to find her at the table, muttering under her breath, her hands scribbling feverishly in one of her many notebooks. I tried to talk to her. I told her that she was taking this too far, that these theories were warping her mind. But she wouldn't listen. Every attempt at reasoning was met with resistance, her eyes wild with fear and conviction. "You don't understand," she'd say, her voice trembling. "They're watching us. They know." At first, I thought it was just exhaustion, her lack of sleep catching up to her. But then things escalated. She became convinced our house was bugged, that we were being watched by unseen forces. I'd find her checking the windows at all hours, peeking through the blinds like some caged animal. She stopped talking to me altogether, withdrawing into herself, her muttering becoming more frantic. Sometimes I'd catch her standing in the dark corners of the house, speaking to someone, or something, I couldn't see. I was worried, but not scared. Not yet. It wasn't until I started finding the evidence that I realized just how far she had fallen. One evening I came home from work and found Natalie in the garage. She was standing over the workbench, her back to me, something crumpled in her hands. The garage door was open, a bitter wind sweeping in from the outside. When I called her name, she didn't respond. My heart quickened. I took a few steps forward, trying to get a glimpse of what she was holding. When she finally turned, I saw it, a rag soaked in something dark, too dark to be oil. "Where did you get that?" I asked, my voice steady but my insides churning. She stared at me for a long moment, then shrugged. "It's nothing," she said flatly, turning back to the bench. I wanted to press her, to demand answers, but something in her demeanor, something cold, detached, made me hesitate. I let it go, though my mind raced with possibilities I didn't want to consider. That night, I lay awake, unable to shake the image of that bloodied cloth from my mind. I told myself it wasn't blood, that it couldn't be. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The discoveries kept coming. A few days later, I opened the freezer to grab some ice for a drink and found something that made my blood run cold, a lock of hair, tied neatly with string, tucked in beside the frozen peas. It was human hair. Dark, thick, and unmistakable. I confronted Natalie immediately, shaking with anger and fear. "What is this? Why the hell is there hair in our freezer?" She didn't look up from her notebook, her pen scratching furiously across the page. "It's part of the plan," she said, her voice eerily calm. "I need it for what's coming." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "What's coming? Natalie, this is insane. You need help." For the first time in weeks, she looked directly at me, her eyes dark and hollow. "You don't understand. They're coming for us. I'm trying to keep us safe, but you're too blind to see it." Her voice was low, dangerous. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. It was like I didn't know her anymore. The woman I loved, the woman I had built a life with, was slipping away, replaced by someone, or something, unrecognizable. I started searching the house when she was out, desperate to find some explanation, something that would make all of this make sense. What I found was worse than I could have imagined. Her notebook. The one she had been so protective of. I don't know what possessed me to open it, but when I did, I felt the ground shift beneath me. Pages and pages of meticulous notes, diagrams, and drawings. But it wasn't just random theories anymore. It was a plan. A plan for something terrible. There were lists of supplies, rope, knives, gasoline, and detailed instructions for something. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The more I read, the clearer it became. She wasn't just paranoid. She was preparing for something. And then I found the sketches. Horrible, detailed sketches of bodies, twisted, mutilated, bound. Some of them were labeled with names. My name. I dropped the notebook as if it had burned me, my stomach turning. What the hell was she planning? I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? That my wife was acting strange? That she was obsessed with conspiracy theories? They'd laugh me off the phone. I tried talking to her again, but she was too far gone. She would barely look at me now, her muttering more frantic, her eyes darting to the windows as if expecting someone, or something, to appear. Then came the night I woke up to the sound of footsteps. It was around 3 a.m., the house completely still except for the soft creaking of floorboards just outside our bedroom door. I listened, my heart pounding in my ears, as the footsteps moved down the hall, slow and deliberate. For a moment, I thought it was Natalie, wandering the house like she often did. But something felt different this time, heavier, more menacing. I slid out of bed and crept toward the door, my breath shallow. As I reached for the handle, the footsteps stopped. The silence was suffocating. I opened the door just a crack and peeked into the hallway. No one. But there was a shadow, a dark, hulking figure standing at the end of the hall, just barely visible in the dim light. I froze, my body paralyzed with fear. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching. I blinked, and it was gone. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I knew then that I had to leave. I couldn't stay in that house, not with her, not with whatever was happening. I packed a bag the next morning while she was out, my mind racing. I needed to get away, to clear my head, to figure out what to do next. But before I could leave, I heard the front door creak open. Natalie was back. I shoved the bag under the bed and walked into the living room, trying to act normal. She was standing by the door, her eyes wild, her hands shaking. "They're here," she whispered. "They're watching us." I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, watching as she paced back and forth, muttering to herself, her paranoia consuming her. And then she stopped. Slowly, she turned to face me, a strange smile creeping across her face. "I've made arrangements," she said softly. "We'll be safe soon. You'll see." I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't want to know.